what is governance? Governance is defined to mean the system by which organisations are directed and managed. So that means setting policy and strategic direction for an organisation rather than the day-to-day tasks of running the organisation. So it's the overall strategic perspectives that I'm concerned with. The nub of what I'm talking about today is about risk management and best governance and avoiding legal liability and avoiding litigation. So avoiding litigation from the smallest club right up to the largest clubs and organisations. Essentially, it's about risk management and keeping your house in good order. And there's a number of basics that everyone needs to be aware of when they're running an organisation. Each board member is responsible to ensure that the annual financial statement submitted to Business Affairs Victoria is an accurate account of the books of the organisation and its annual transactions. So most sporting organisations, if not all, are incorporated associations, and as part of that requirement for being an incorporated association under the relevant Act, they have to submit to the government each year their books of account. So if those books of account are inaccurate and board members haven't properly checked that the finances of the organisation are being properly accounted for and cared for, if you like, then board members can be personally exposed to legal liability. Famous case from Victoria, which goes back to the 1980s, was a fellow called John Friedrich and the National Safety Council. He was running basically a $200 million organisation which was about search and rescue. There was a board of all volunteer members on the board, so unpaid board members, and this fellow was stealing money from the organisation. It came out at a later point in time, some years down the track, and he had been hoodwinking all of the board members, them believing that the books of account being presented to them were accurate. The organisation lost hundreds of millions, and the banks who funded the organisation said, well, who's going to pay us for all of this lost money? And in that case, it went to the courts of Victoria, and one of the board members, despite being an unpaid board member, was found personally liable for that debt. To explain that duty, even if you are not an accountant or a person with accounting qualifications, but you've got an accountant on your board, you still have an obligation to consider and satisfy yourself as to the accuracy of the financial report. You can't simply pass the buck. If the annual report is hiding losses, or an organisation such as a financial institution relies on an incorrect annual report and suffers a loss as a result, then board members could be held personally liable for that loss. There's a number of duties that apply, both because of Acts of Parliament and also because of the law generally, even though they're not written anywhere. And just to list a number of them, they include that you have a duty to act in accordance with the Articles of Association or the Constitution of the organisation. So the first thing as a board member you must do is read your Constitution. And it sounds very simple and basic to say, but you'd be amazed at how many people don't. And then when trouble arises, they realise that either they haven't got their Constitution up to date, or they're not aware of what's in it, or they thought that a change had been made, but that change hadn't been registered with the proper government organisation. So that first point is having a knowledge of your Constitution and acting in accordance with it. So you can't act outside that. Your next point is acting to the best of your skill and ability. So you must act diligently in carrying out your task. No one expects a person who doesn't have an accounting qualification to be as on top of accounting and monetary issues within the organisation as someone who does have that qualification. So the law doesn't expect something that's unreasonable, but you must act to the best of your skill and ability. If you don't, then you could find yourself in some trouble. Another common and straightforward issue, but I think it gets taken a bit for granted, is avoiding conflicts of interest. You might have a personal interest, for example, say selecting your child for a team, it's obvious to say that it's improper for you to try and influence the coach to select your child for a team, for example. Another example is if decisions are being made at the board level and you're a board member of that club or organisation and you have a direct influence, whether it's a financial decision such as selecting a contractor to provide a service to the club, the best governance practice says that you must stand aside from that meeting so that the decision can be made. So provided that you don't involve yourself in decisions, then there's no conflict of interest. And there's other further explanations for that, but in a nutshell, you have to avoid those conflicts of interest. And I think we all know that they're there, but it's a worthwhile reminder and it's a legal duty that you have. A couple of final points that the law requires is that you act for the benefit of the association as a whole and for a proper purpose. That's in the case of someone acting for example, a league. In a club, it goes without saying that you can act for the club and its interests. And for example, when you're going to a league meeting, of course you're going to represent the interests of your club because there's not really any conflict for you to seek to represent anyone else. You're not to improperly use your board position or information gained as a board member, and you must act honestly and in good faith. So that summarises all of your obligations under the law generally that you have as a board member. And it might seem obvious to say those things, but quite apart from them seeming common sense, the more important point is you could find yourself in trouble with the law if you don't comply with those requirements and someone suffers loss as a consequence. The other broad and simple point about your duties as a board member is that you have to make sure that the organisation complies with various broad legal requirements. And an example is ensuring that coaches, etc., have their working with children checks, for example. You have to ensure that equal opportunity policies are implemented and applied and not breached. And there's a number of other trading, taxation and occupational health and safety laws that you, as a board member, the buck stops with you and you're responsible for making sure that these things are implemented.